The tires screamed before anyone understood what was happening. 1 second there was control, precision, the kind of calm that had defined their partnership for years, and the next there was the violent shudder of metal folding into itself, a sound so sharp it seemed to split the air in two. Heat rose from the wreckage in slow waves. People stopped moving. No one spoke, because everyone in that moment knew the number, even if they never said it out loud. $300,000, reduced to twisted glass and silence. But the money wasn't the real cost, was it? It was what that crash represented. Trust, reputation, the unspoken belief that together they were untouchable. And then there was him, the one who never lost composure, the one who built his identity on control, standing perfectly still, staring at the damage as if it were something much deeper than a machine. Have you ever watched someone face the exact scenario they built their life trying to avoid? That quiet is different. It's not shock, it's calculation. It's the fragile space where blame, disappointment, and ego are all waiting for permission to speak. No one stepped forward. No one knew which way this would turn. Because this wasn't just an accident. This was the kind of moment that ends partnerships, the kind that rewrites history and forces people to choose between self-protection and loyalty. You could almost feel the future hanging there, suspended in the air with the smell of burnt rubber and the echo of what had just been lost. And yet, if you had looked closely, you would have noticed something else. Not anger, not panic, something forming behind his eyes, something no one expected. Because in the next few seconds, a single sentence would be spoken, so simple, so disarming, that it would change not only what this crash meant, but what their partnership would become from that day forward. Before the crash, before the silence, before the question of whether it was all about to end, there were two forces moving in perfect tension. That's what made them powerful. One was discipline embodied, measured, analytical, allergic to chaos. He believed success was engineered through preparation, through systems, through thinking 3 moves ahead. The other was instinct in human form, decisive, bold, comfortable with uncertainty. Where one saw risk to be minimized, the other saw opportunity to be seized. On paper, they should have canceled each other out, and yet, together, they became something the industry couldn't ignore. Their rise wasn't accidental. It was built on that friction. When precision met instinct, decisions were sharper. When caution met ambition, moves were calculated but fearless. People around them started to notice the pattern. They won contracts others couldn't secure. They executed projects others said were too volatile. They recovered from setbacks that would have buried smaller teams. Over time, a reputation formed, not just of competence, but of inevitability. If they were involved, success felt pre-written. Do you know how rare that is? To be seen not as capable, but as unstoppable? Authority followed. Investors trusted them. Partners deferred to them. Competitors studied them. It's easy to admire harmony, but what people truly respect is controlled tension. They argued, but it was productive. They challenged each other, but without ego dominating the room. One would push forward, the other would pull back just enough to avoid disaster. It was a rhythm, almost musical, and the world began to believe that rhythm could not be broken. But here's what most people misunderstand about partnerships like that. The very differences that create momentum also create fault lines. Precision can feel like hesitation to someone who thrives on speed. Instinct can feel reckless to someone who values control. The balance works beautifully until pressure intensifies, and when it does, those differences don't disappear, they magnify. That's why the crash mattered so much. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about damaged equipment or headlines. It struck directly at the center of what made them effective. If control failed, what did that say about the strategist? If instinct miscalculated, what did that say about the risk-taker? When your identity is intertwined with your role, mistakes don't feel external, they feel personal. The industry believed they were untouchable, But partnerships built on tension don't break slowly. They break at the exact point where difference turns into doubt. And when that moment comes, it doesn't test your talent, it tests who you are when the myth starts to crack. Success has a way of hiding the fractures that are forming underneath it. From the outside, everything still looked seamless. The results were still arriving. The respect was still growing. And yet, the conversations between them had begun to change in ways no audience could see. What used to be debates driven by curiosity slowly carried an edge. The planner started asking for more safeguards, more time, more data, not because he had lost his confidence, but because the scale of what they were handling now meant that every decision had consequences far beyond the two of them. The instinctive one heard those requests differently. To him, it sounded like hesitation, like the very energy that built their rise was being filtered through caution. Have you ever noticed how the same strength that creates momentum can later be interpreted as resistance? Money amplified everything. When the numbers were small, risk felt like courage. When the numbers reached a level where a single mistake could erase years of progress, risk began to feel personal. It wasn't just about strategy anymore, it was about identity. One of them carried the quiet weight of protecting what they had built. The other carried the unspoken fear of becoming predictable. Neither was wrong, and that is what made the tension so dangerous, because conflicts that have a clear villain are easier to solve than the ones where both people are protecting something valuable. Then came the voices from the outside, the advisors, the stakeholders, the people who benefit from success but never share the responsibility for failure. They praised one for his discipline and whispered that the other was pushing too far. They admired the other's boldness and hinted that caution was slowing everything down. And if you've ever led anything meaningful, you know how difficult it is to keep your partnership intact when the world starts rewarding your differences separately. It plants questions you would never have asked on your own. It makes you wonder whether the very person who helped you rise is now the reason you feel constrained. The ego never arrives as arrogance, it arrives as protection. It says, I carried us through that last challenge, or without my decision we wouldn't be here. These thoughts don't get spoken, but they change the tone of a meeting, the length of a pause, the way eye contact is held or avoided. Small delays become symbols, minor disagreements begin to feel like verdicts. And still, the results kept coming, which made it even easier to ignore the shift. Because as long as the world keeps applauding, who wants to be the one to admit something is breaking? The clock was moving, though neither of them acknowledged it. Each new project carried higher stakes, each deadline allowed less room for error, and the margin for misalignment became thinner than either of them realized. What once felt like creative tension started to feel like a test of control. You could sense that one decisive moment would force everything into the open, the kind of moment that doesn't ask for preparation or permission. And then came the morning that began like every other successful day they had ever experienced, with plans in place and expectations high, right before everything went wrong. The mistake didn't look dramatic at first. That's the unsettling truth about turning points. They arrive disguised as ordinary decisions made a fraction too fast or a fraction too late. One calculation trusted instinct when caution was needed. One moment of confidence stretched beyond its margin, and suddenly the outcome that had always been theoretical became real. The sound that followed was not just the collapse of something expensive, it was the collapse of the illusion that they were immune to consequences. In a single instant, the number attached itself to everything. $300,000, a figure heavy enough to silence a room, a figure that translated success into vulnerability. You could feel the shift in how people stood around them. No one rushed forward with solutions. No one offered immediate reassurance, because everyone understood what was truly at stake was not the loss itself, but the question of responsibility. High-performing partnerships are admired for their unity, yet in moments like this, unity becomes fragile. Who speaks first? Who takes ownership? Who protects their position?
These are the questions that don't need words to be heard. They live in the space between two people who have built their reputations side by side and now find themselves facing the first undeniable fracture. The financial impact was obvious, but the deeper cost was invisible. Every past victory replayed itself against this single error, as if asking whether those wins had been skill or luck. The planner saw the confirmation of every risk he had quietly feared. The instinctive one felt the weight of being the variable that had finally gone too far. This is the moment most partnerships cannot survive, not because of the loss, but because of the meaning each person assigns to it. Have you ever noticed how quickly a shared dream can become two separate internal narratives? What made it harder was the presence of others. The industry that once celebrated them was now watching for a reaction, not out of cruelty, but out of curiosity. People lean in when legends face their first real test. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. No raised voices, no immediate analysis, just the quiet recognition that something irreversible had happened. And in that quiet, every previous disagreement, every external whisper, every unspoken fear seemed to gather in one place. He looked at the damage, then at his partner, and in that brief exchange, the entire history of their rise passed between them without a single word. There are moments when the future of a relationship is decided before anyone speaks, when observers begin to step back emotionally because they assume the ending is already written. It felt like that kind of ending, the kind where two people walk away separately, carrying their own version of what went wrong. And for everyone watching, the conclusion seemed obvious. This was where the partnership would break. What happened next did not follow the script everyone had already written in their minds. There was no tightening of the jaw, no inventory of mistakes delivered like a verdict, no protective distance to signal that the partnership had just become a liability. Instead, he stepped closer to the wreckage, then closer to the person standing there carrying the invisible weight of it, and in a voice so steady it almost felt out of place, he said the one thing no one expected to hear. He said that the loss was real, the number was painful, but none of it mattered more than what they had built together. He said they would solve the problem the same way they had created every success, side by side. In that moment, blame had nowhere to land. Have you ever witnessed how quickly tension dissolves when someone refuses to protect their ego? It is disarming because it rewrites the hierarchy of the situation. The conversation was no longer about who was responsible. It became about who they had chosen to be for each other. Loyalty stopped being a word they used in interviews and became a visible decision made under pressure. Leadership stopped meaning control and started meaning emotional safety. And friendship, the part people usually assume is separate from performance, revealed itself as the very thing that made performance sustainable.
You could almost feel the air change. The observers who had prepared themselves for a fracture were now watching something rarer, a public redefinition of strength. Strength was not the ability to avoid failure, it was the willingness to absorb the shock of it without turning on the person beside you. The one who had made the mistake looked up as if the ground had shifted beneath him, because the narrative he had been preparing, defend yourself, explain, accept distance, was suddenly unnecessary. Relief arrived not as celebration, but as a quiet release, the kind that lets a person breathe again. That single sentence did something even more powerful than saving a partnership. It removed the fear that had been silently growing between them. When you know that your worst moment will be met with loyalty instead of accusation, you stop operating from self-protection and start operating from trust. Think about how rare that is in any high-stakes environment. Most people collaborate while guarding their own exit. They innovate carefully. They speak cautiously. But here, in the aftermath of a very public loss, a different contract had just been written. And this is the part that turns a story into a lesson. The financial damage was still there. The repair would still take time. The reputation would still have to absorb the impact. Yet none of those things define the outcome anymore. The meaning of the crash had been reframed in real time. It was no longer the moment that exposed their limits. It became the moment that proved their values.
Long after the numbers were forgotten, that line would be repeated because it answered a question every partnership eventually faces. When everything goes wrong, do you protect your position or your person? Something shifted after that sentence, not in the numbers on their balance sheet, but in the silent agreements between their hearts. Before, every win had carried the hidden fear of the next loss. Every decision weighed against the memory of that $300,000 drop that once felt like a verdict on their competence and their trust. Now there was a different gravity in the room. They began to ask a new question, not who is responsible, but what are we building that is bigger than this moment? And that subtle change rewired everything. They redesigned the way they spoke to each other, replacing defensive updates with honest check-ins that made space for doubt without turning it into accusation. Success stopped being a personal scoreboard and became shared evidence that their method worked. Failure, which once threatened to fracture them, became raw material for refinement. Notice the sequence: trust first, results second. That is the opposite of how most partnerships operate, and it is why their next projects carried a calm intensity instead of desperation. The irony is that their biggest wins arrived quietly. A deal that would have terrified their former selves was approached with the same measured conversations they had practiced in smaller decisions. When pressure rose, one of them would repeat that line almost like a ritual, and you could feel the temperature drop. Isn't that what real leadership does? It lowers the emotional cost of uncertainty. Clients sensed it, teams aligned faster, and opportunities that once required force began to open through respect. They also changed how they celebrated. Instead of chasing the loud validation that used to mask their anxiety, they marked progress in private conversations where they acknowledged how differently they were showing up. You can measure revenue, but how do you measure the moment when two people choose loyalty over ego without even discussing it? That became their real currency. The crash that once defined their story turned into a reference point for resilience, a reminder that they had already survived the worst version of themselves. And because they no longer feared the end of the partnership, they began to think in decades instead of quarters. They invested in systems, in people, in patience. The work deepened, not because it was easier, but because it was finally honest. Here is the legacy piece most viewers miss. The external growth was simply a reflection of an internal contract rewritten in a moment of calm. When your bond can absorb a $300,000 mistake and return stronger, what ceiling is left? This is why their later success felt different, not like escape from the past, but like integration of it. They hired with the same values, negotiated with the same steadiness, and walked away from offers that threatened the culture they had protected. The partnership stopped being a vehicle for profit and became a structure for meaning. And if you're listening closely, you realize the invitation is personal. What conversation?
Step back from the numbers for a moment, and you begin to see why this story keeps echoing long after the loss was recovered. It was never about $300,000. It was about the moment when pressure revealed character, and character chose connection over control. Everyone has a partnership like this, even if it is not in business. It might be a friend, a spouse, a sibling, a co-founder, someone with whom your future is quietly tied. And sooner or later, there is always a crash, an unexpected drop that asks a single uncomfortable question. Are we more committed to being right or to staying aligned? What that calm response proved is that trust is not built during expansion, but during contraction. When everything is rising, loyalty is easy, leadership is loud, and promises are cheap. Under strain, leadership becomes the ability to regulate your own fear so that the other person does not have to carry it for you. That is the redefinition most people miss. We think strength is the capacity to correct, to dominate, to assign responsibility quickly. Yet the real authority in that moment came from restraint, from the refusal to let a temporary outcome rewrite a permanent relationship. Notice how universal that is. In teams, in families, in creative collaborations, the partnership either becomes a scoreboard or it becomes a sanctuary. A scoreboard keeps record of every mistake and every sacrifice. A sanctuary holds the shared vision above the daily fluctuations. Which one are you building without realizing it? The crash simply exposed the structure that was already there. Their choice transformed it into a place where risk could exist without threatening belonging, and that is why their later success carried depth instead of fragility. There is also a quieter lesson about identity. Most people secretly believe they are only as valuable as their last result, which is why pressure turns them into versions of themselves they barely recognize. But when one person says, in effect, "I choose you over the outcome," it interrupts that narrative. It allows both people to operate from purpose instead of fear. Imagine how many decisions would change in your own life if the relationship mattered more than the immediate win. This is why the story still matters, not because of the recovery, not because of the growth that followed, but because it offers a model for leadership that is deeply human. It reminds you that the real test is not how you perform when you are confident, but how you protect the bond when you are disappointed. The $300,000 crash becomes a symbol, a shared memory that says we have already seen the worst and we did not turn against each other. So the question that lingers is personal and simple. When your moment arrives, when the numbers fall or the plan breaks, what will your first sentence build? Because that sentence will outlive the problem. And if this story stays with you,